Sight and Insight by Rowland. Copyright Longman Group Limited, 1974. Commentary for Filmstrip 3.
Last time we looked at shapes and the spaces between them. We decided that enclosed or nearly enclosed spaces help to produce a relationship between the shapes that formed them. In this picture, the two shapes are related because they share a space between them, a space we can make out quite easily. If we look at this space carefully, we see that it has quite a definite character, a bulge between two narrow gorges. And if we wanted to change it, we should also change the relationship of the two shapes. Most people wouldn't be aware of this space or the part it plays, but there can be no doubt about its importance. In this etching by the German artist Paul Klee, a strange, tall woman feeds a flower to an animal behind her. Now, the reason we're looking at this picture is not because of its subject matter, but because it has certain qualities which make it interesting as a picture. The way these two shapes, the woman and the animal, are combined produces a well-defined space between them. It's so well-defined, so easy to see that pictorially, that is, as a part of the picture, it is as important as the shapes. The artist designed this picture to give the space between the shapes special importance, an importance far greater than that of an ordinary space. This space is rather similar to the shape of the animal. We feel as though the body of the animal might be fitted into the space in front of it, so that the forward movement of the animal is helped along by the relationship of shapes and spaces. In this abstract design, space again plays an essential part. Here too, the space is very definite, but it's a little more difficult to take it in and to see it as a shape. Even so, you might say that the relationship between the fluid shape and the equally fluid space inside is the subject of the picture. In this gate of a house in Paris, shapes and spaces are equally important. The artist who designed it didn't bother with the usual iron ornaments, but instead produced a design in which shapes and spaces are harmoniously combined. This relationship was as important to him as it was to the artist of the round design we saw in the last picture, or to Paul Klee. We can't possibly avoid or overlook the spaces, some of which are formed between the solid parts of the design and some are just outlined by the thinner pieces of iron. The spaces play an important role in the overall effect of the design. When we looked at Filmstrip 2, we saw what happens when we put a single shape on the rectangle, and we discovered that every time we moved this shape, we created a new shape around it, a new meaning and a new visual sentence. The same also applies to two or more shapes with their enclosed space, but it's just a little more complicated. Let's look again at the two shapes we saw at the beginning. They've now been placed on the rectangle in such a way that the left-hand shape touches the baseline, and between this shape and the left-hand edge of the picture we can see a counter shape, as in the case of the single shape last time. But we must also consider the effect of this change on the space between the shapes. When we saw these shapes before, the inner space was allowed to stream outwards, top and bottom, into the surrounding space. But now, in this position, we have affected the relationship between the inner space and the space around the shapes. As the inner space flows out towards the bottom, it is hemmed in by the angle formed between the left-hand shape and the bottom edge of the picture. It must curve upwards, round the red shape, and into the main open space. The space between the two shapes is a part of the space around them. It's connected to it because the two shapes are a bit apart. But by placing them in a certain position, we have affected the way the inner space relates, the way it is linked to the rest of the space. We have molded them into a definite relationship. If we move the two shapes, together of course, to another part of the same rectangle, we make that rectangle into yet another shape, as we did in the case of the single shape on the rectangle. In this new arrangement, in this picture, the countershape on the left is not nearly as noticeable as it was in the last, while a new countershape has appeared on the right, because the right-hand shape is now closer to the edge. You will see that this new countershape links up with the inner space in a way which is quite different from that in the last picture. Wherever we move the two shapes, the visual sentence they form will be affected in this way. The way in which shapes are put together is normally called composition. As we've seen, composition involves not only the relationships of shapes to each other and to the spaces between them, but also to the shapes on which we've placed them, the piece of paper or other surface on which we make our picture or design. This is a landscape drawing by the English painter Richard Wilson. There is a group of 3 trees on the right, some water in front of them, a human figure on the left walking along a path at a higher level, trees, shrubs, a hill, sky. So much for the subject matter, nothing at all unusual. But as a composition, this is quite a remarkable drawing because the shapes have been very cleverly composed. The diagram explains this more clearly. There are 3 main shapes with a large white space at the top and 2 small spaces at the bottom, roughly in the shape of triangles between them. These spaces at the bottom are really the path and the water, but pictorially speaking, in the composition, they are spaces between the shapes, or countershapes. If we look at the right-hand triangular space and move in the direction of its lower outline and beyond it, we arrive at the tip of the left-hand triangular space. This is how the two are related. It is also here that the top space has its lowest point, so that all 3 spaces come into contact here. You can say they are related through this point. The artist thought this spot important, and he's placed a human figure there to mark its importance. There is another point of this kind, where the center shape almost touches the right-hand shape, while still allowing the space to flow between them. Another area of interest is a group of 3 trees on the right. The trees are related to each other very much like the 3 we saw in the first film strip. Wilson's drawing is probably a fairly accurate representation of what the artist saw in front of him. But as I said before, there are 2 ways of looking at everything, as things and as shapes. It's also possible to look at our environment in both ways at the same time. This artist saw the things in the drawing not only as things, but also as shapes which react to each other, and in this respect, as shapes, he could bring them into relationships. How did he do this? He could have drawn the outline, the plane of the picture, that is the surface on which all the other shapes are placed, in many different places. He could have placed the shapes on many different kinds of rectangle, or even squares. He chose this particular one because it gave him the most interesting relationships between the shapes and the spaces around them. This is an abstract picture or composition, that is to say, it doesn't represent anything. The shapes are related to the spaces and to the large rectangle on which they are composed. You'll notice that the 3 main shapes contain smaller ones, which are also related to each other and to the large rectangle on which they are. Each one of these main shapes can be thought of as a composition in its own right, and they are rather like each other. So they are related in 2 ways, through their likeness and through their composition within the rectangle. In this composition, there are no definite, clear outlines. We can barely speak of shapes. The dark areas look like transparent layers, overlapping like veils, growing very dark and dense in places, and then thinning out again. We notice more the darkness and denseness than the shapes. Yet in spite of there being no definite outlines, the relationship between shapes and spaces is still there, but shapes and spaces mix more freely. In this picture we can recognize 3 girls, dressed, it seems, for a masked ball. They may remind us of the 3 trees I mentioned before, 2 of them close together and the third only slightly apart. Their bodies have been massed together into one big shape, which has been very carefully placed in relation to the shape which forms the picture plane. If the large square had been larger or smaller, the relationships between shapes and spaces would have been different. The pattern on the dresses, which reminds us of the third picture of this film strip, takes part in this relationship. There are three spaces, or countershapes, in this picture, one on either side of the group and one slightly to the left of the center line. This irregular arrangement of spaces is caused by the irregular arrangement of shapes. If these three figures had been arranged with one exactly in the middle and the others spaced out exactly the same on either side, the result would have been far less eye-catching. As a composition, it would probably have been pretty dull. We can get an idea of this if we compare these two arrangements of lines. The one on the right, with its varying spaces, gives us more to look at, to examine, and to get interested in. If you think back to the various compositions we've been looking at, you'll remember that they were all arranged irregularly, the spaces getting broader here, narrower there in relation to the shapes. In a composition, the shapes are always compared with spaces, and the other way around. As I said before, this comparison is brought about by looking at, tuning into the shapes, then to the spaces, then going back to the shapes again, then to the spaces, and so on. Actually, we're doing this kind of thing, or trying to do it without knowing it, in our everyday lives all the time. When we put a vase on the table, off-center, and try to bring about a pleasant relationship between the part of the tabletop on one side of the vase and that on the other side, and of course between the tabletop and the vase itself. When we decide where to place an easy chair in a room, where to hang a picture on a wall, or even where to stick a label on a parcel. When we are doing all these, we make several quick comparisons between shapes or between shapes and spaces, and adjust them till the relationship satisfies us, and there is no one best arrangement. Now imagine you've been asked to arrange a number of objects which are all the same, for instance a number of jars, on a shelf. You could do it, as most people would, in a perfectly regular way, as in this picture. But now that you've been looking at shapes and spaces in a rather different way, perhaps this arrangement doesn't please you. You may feel it's monotonous. In the arrangement of shapes and spaces we looked at before, something was always happening in a visual sense. Spaces grew wider and narrower. They touched and linked up. They balanced and harmonized. We could find more and more relationships the longer we looked at them. But here nothing happens. As your eye passes along the row, jar follows jar and space follows space with unfailing regularity. And so you decide that this arrangement has no interest and you want to change it. Of course, there are many different possibilities, and here you can see one of them. The spaces between the jars have been varied. The jars themselves are of course still the same as before. The spaces are now irregular, but they're not haphazard. They seem to have been related to each other, compared with each other, as in the other compositions we've been looking at. Perhaps it's easier to understand this if we look at shapes rather than objects. Here, a number of shapes, rather like lines, have been arranged so that they aren't monotonous or boring, even though the shapes themselves are the same. But neither is there too much irregularity. There are one or two jumps, that is, contrast between very wide and very narrow spaces, but no more than is needed to keep us interested. The principle, the underlying idea on which these shapes were arranged, is very similar to the one which applied to compositions. You can think of an arrangement like this as a composition of shapes which, instead of spreading over an area, runs from side to side. It's a horizontal composition. Nowadays, buildings, particularly large ones, are often quite monotonous and dull to look at, with row upon row of windows all the same. But in this building, there's a great deal of variety in the arrangement of windows, or you could say, in the division of the one large window. The architect realized that a building needs a certain amount of visual interest. At the same time, there's not too much excitement that might soon have had a tiring effect. The lines are much taller than the ones you saw in the last picture, but they've been related to each other in much the same way. And in this building, the stripes are even taller, but the principle remains the same. It also applies to many natural shapes, like this plant. The stripes of each leaf can be looked at in much the same way as the stripes of the last building we saw. And shapes which don't have clear outlines, like these, can also be related in this way. We can add more interest to an arrangement of shapes and spaces by bringing in color. Try and remember some of the color compositions in Filmstrip 2. We saw that colors may have the effect of detaching shapes from each other, so that, although they are in the same plane, they also have a suggestion of depth. We can apply this to our arrangements of shapes and spaces, our horizontal compositions, to add depth as well as variety. Some colors will seem to come forward to meet us, others will move away from us. We can even imagine these colored upright shapes to be hanging in space at different distances from us. The colors have something to do with the effect of each shape. Some appear soft and gentle, others sharp and biting. Some of them look warm, others cool, and so on. These qualities will affect the way we choose to arrange the shapes. If all these shapes had been the same color, we should probably have wanted to arrange them differently, in a different order, and with different spaces between them. If the shapes to be arranged were not only in different colors, but also of entirely different forms, as in this picture, then we would have to consider these differences. In the previous examples, the shapes all had straight sides, but now we're dealing with irregular shapes, and the counter shapes between them are therefore equally irregular. This may remind you of the enclosed spaces you saw at the beginning of this film strip. We saw then that the space between the shapes may be connected with and related to the space surrounding the shapes. This is also true of horizontal compositions with irregular shapes. Irregular shapes and spaces produce, on the whole, richer relationships. We've covered a lot of ground, and difficult ground at that. By now, some of you may begin to think it's all getting rather complicated and difficult to understand. But it isn't really. We've only looked in a little more detail at things we all understand instinctively anyway. And we've done this because looking at them in this way may make us a little better at it. We began the subject of horizontal compositions by arranging a number of shapes which were exactly the same. If you now do the same with any number of unequal, irregular objects or shapes, you won't find it any more difficult than the earlier, simpler exercise. It's a question of using your instincts and, if necessary, helping them along with a little thought, but you can't do it by thought alone. There are no rules in this any more than there are rules about how to make up a tune. If you think about this, it's soon clear that making pictures and composing music, visual composition and musical composition, have a lot in common. If you're humming to yourself while you're doing something, you may be making up a tune. Yet nobody tells you how long a certain note should be, how long the next note should be, and so on. You use your instinct without thinking about it. You just feel your way along. And that's how it is with visual compositions. Now, we can't push this too far. The comparison between visual composition and musical composition, or going even further, between vision and sound, can't be accurate. Still, a simple tune may be, in one way, like our arrangement of shapes and spaces. The succession of sounds, the way they follow each other, is like the succession of shapes, the way they follow each other. So far, we have only looked at single rows of shapes and spaces, like tunes. But what happens when two or more such rows are put together? What you see here is not an attempt to make a picture of a definite piece of music, but it does have a musical idea behind it, a row of irregularly spaced shapes, which we could compare to a tune, and a row of regularly spaced shapes, which we could think of as the accompaniment or the beat. By itself, the bottom row might look dull and unexciting. The top row acts as a kind of decoration, as well as a contrast. But you don't need to have one regularly spaced row. Both rows may be irregular, as in this picture. The bottom row has more contrast between wide and narrow spaces than the top row. We could say it has a different character. Although the two rows are quite different from each other, the shapes of the two rows meet in several places. Can you find where? The difference between the two rows is not caused by the shapes themselves, but by the way in which they are arranged. Each of the rows seems to have a different character, a different quality. For want of a better word, we'll call this quality rhythm. Visual rhythm is rather different from musical rhythm. It's a way of placing or painting shapes in a certain sequence in which both shapes and spaces are related. Anyone can make visual rhythms just as anyone can make musical rhythms, but obviously some will be better than others. There can be many different sorts of visual rhythms. In nature, the way in which things or substances, like water, arrange themselves is often rhythmical, as for instance here, in this picture, of streams of condensation running down window panes. We can combine more than just 2 rows of rhythmically composed shapes. Here we have 4 rows of shapes. The shapes are not all the same size. The rows are designed so that some of the shapes and some of the spaces link up across the rows from top to bottom, and so relate the rows to each other and into one big pattern. You can follow the rhythm of a single row from side to side, or, stopping in your tracks from time to time, follow another rhythm from top to bottom. We can't say that we've actually taken in the picture, that we've really understood it, unless we can do these 2 things at the same time. It's rather like listening to a piece of music. We follow the tune and also hear the harmonies at the same time. Color can add a great deal to such a picture and make it richer. For instance, here, the shapes are similar in size. They are either single or in groups of 2 or 3. The spaces also fall in with this simple plan, and we can follow the same idea in the vertical rows. The whole area is covered with a simple rhythm. This rhythm is made richer and more interesting by the color relationships, that is, the way the colors react to each other. Rhythms are not only found in 2 dimensions. Here, solid shapes are arranged in the rhythm. As in the case of the flat shapes we looked at before, the rhythm is made by the shapes and spaces and the relationships between them. But here we must also look at the different depth of each piece, and this adds a lot of variety to the rhythm. Wavy curved lines have rhythms which we may look at in several ways. Here you could think of all the crests of the waves of a row forming one rhythm, the valleys another. Or you might think of the upright parts of the wavy lines. This is shown in the second row. We can also work it the other way around. How would you make the ordinary rhythm at the bottom into a wavy rhythm like the top row? Now, if you fill in the spaces between the wavy lines, you have joined them into a rhythmic shape, like the blue one. At the bottom, the dark red is also a rhythmic shape, and these shapes have different rhythms and move along side by side like 2 tunes in music. If you look at the space between them, the light red part, long enough, you'll see it as a shape, and another one at the top edge of the picture with its own rhythm running alongside. In the last 5 pictures we saw rhythms which covered a whole area. We could make rhythms which cover an area in yet another way. Here some rows run from side to side, others from top to bottom. They run over each other so that many of the lines overlap. After this, the next few pictures shouldn't cause you any difficulty at all. In this picture, irregular shapes are arranged like the cells of a plant, in long and short rhythmic rows which fit into each other. In this picture also, shapes have been rhythmically arranged, but here there's a suggestion of movement, several movements, in different directions, at different speeds. There is rhythm in this arrangement of semicircles. You could follow several rows of shapes in different directions. These shapes may bulge to either side and so produce a richer effect than squares. But even if you don't go into such detail, the overall impression of this picture is rhythmical. We can now sense a rhythm spread out over an area and not merely a number of rows. So is this picture. The shapes are not clearly defined, but we can sense their rhythmic relationships. The lines also have a rhythm, and in places, lines and shapes fit into each other. I've said before that rhythm is to be found not only in the things we make, but everywhere in nature. If you find rhythms in nature and make pictures which display them, it doesn't matter if it isn't clear to anyone but yourself where they come from. For instance, this picture was inspired by a landscape I saw. It has many shapes and lines and rhythmic relationships, which were the most important aspect of the landscape. But this is not the only rhythmic composition the landscape can give us. We could look at it in a different way and then produce a composition like this one. Here the shapes are clearer. They are in different relationships, and the long lines stress certain rhythms. The changed color scheme gives a different impression from the first composition. We could produce many more variations of the same subject, and in this way we might discover things about it we hadn't noticed before. As we have seen, rhythm has nothing to do with the shapes as things, but only with the way in which they are arranged, and with the effect they have on each other, and in the end on us. Understanding rhythm helps us to get to know our environment and how it fits together.